I'll have one final question for you at this point in this podcast. The question is that if some kind of a hot war starts between Israel and other countries in the Middle East,
Say Iran. It's the most likely one.
the question I'll ask you about this nuclear power based conversation is that do you think Israel will fire nuclear weapons at any point at anyone? The other question is linked to the first part of our episode today, which is that with this Israel and Palestine conflict, as well as the Israel and Lebanon conflict, have we seen drone warfare being used much more than it was used in 2014?
I'll quickly answer the sort of second part. We already discussed how Hamas used low-tech, unsophisticated drones with extreme effectiveness against the IDF. The IDF uses some very advanced drones. I can't say more, but including when they need to operate in those confined spaces in Hamas tunnels or tunnels that Hezbollah has dug. They use drones to explore those tunnels instead of having to send infantry units down themselves, because it's extremely unsafe and you can get ambushed at any point. It's low visibility conditions and you want to be able to explore an enormous tunnel network using some form of technology. The Israelis in general have a very large and sophisticated fleet of drones. I mean, one fact that the viewers may be interested in is that up until our purchase of American drones, the only large drones that have been inducted into the Indian Armed Forces for the last 2 decades have been Israeli drones. So, drones are pretty common on the battlefield now. So that's just a quick answer to that. To your question about the use of nuclear weapons, and I think I can answer it not just in the context of Israel, which, by the way, is a nuclear power but doesn't admit that it's a nuclear power formally. But I can also answer the question in the context of Russia, because Russia has talked about being forced into using nuclear weapons if the West intervenes too actively in the war with Ukraine. But in both cases, my answer is no, or at least I would hope not, and I'll tell you why. Once nuclear weapons became a reality on this planet at the end of World War II, and especially since 1953 when the Soviets also tested their own nuclear. So now you had more than one country on the planet. While just the Americans had it, it was like, okay, just the Americans. Now you have more than one country that has nuclear weapons. A concept developed throughout the Cold War, which I think still applies today, called mutually assured destruction. Effectively, the stability of the Cold War political system, but at the end of the day, you knew that you have a USA and you have a USSR, and yes, they'll keep fighting these proxy wars in Afghanistan and Vietnam or in South and Central America and so on and so forth, but they won't, they'll really avoid going to war directly against each other, is because they know that if they go to war against each other, in the natural escalation cycle, they'll both end up at nukes at some point. And if they both end up at nukes at some point, it's mutually assured destruction. It's guaranteed that we're going to destroy ourselves and each other. And I can't prevent you from destroying me, you can't prevent me from destroying you. So once the logic of MAD, mutually assured destruction, became obvious, a lot of academics in this sphere started to prophesize that maybe the nuclear umbrella, the very existence of nuclear weapons, will start to reduce state-on-state conflict itself, because people don't want to take the risk of a nuclear escalation happening. That seemed to be true for a long time. So a lot of people believe that, hey, in the nuclear age, maybe the only kind of war we'll see is between states and non-state actors. So there's no question of a nuclear incident. But, two nuclear powers going at it against each other, extremely unlikely, because, who wants to take that kind of risk? Now, the one caveat I'd add to that is, I think, they say time heals all wounds. I think one of the wounds that time has healed is the wound of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think the world has forgotten what the use of a nuclear weapon actually looks like, and what the consequences are, and what the consequences of nuclear winter are. And so I think that the evidence I'll point to is the fact that the West has been willing to get pretty close to a direct confrontation with Russia, despite the fact that it's a highly nuclearized conflict, if either side wishes. India, for the first time, 2019, Balakot, etc. onwards, decided to call the Pakistani nuclear bluff. See, what was the Pakistani nuclear bluff, Ranveer? Pakistan knew since the 1990s when both countries went nuclear, and they've always known that they can't win a conventional war against India. The asymmetry is just too great. So for Pakistan, their nuclear weapons ended up acting as a deterrent. To say what? If Pakistan takes this stance of having a very low threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, they believe that they would avoid India trying to use conventional forces against them. So I jokingly refer to the Pakistani nuclear policy as the "main pagal hoon" policy. They legitimately like to, I think, convey to the world that our willingness to use nuclear weapons is very high and our threshold trigger for its time to use a nuke is very low. Trying to signal to the Indians, don't even send an infantry division across the border because we'll go nuclear. Main pagal hoon. India called that bluff by saying, I don't think you're as pagal as you're claiming to be, boss. I don't think if I strike terrorist camps across the border, you're going to respond with a nuke, even though you claim to. So we called their bluff and we said, look, boss, you're no longer going to use nuclear cover to then do sub-conventional death by 1,000 cuts, militancy, terrorism, bomb blast, 2611 against India, because we will respond militarily and we're going to assume you're not going to use nukes. That's what changed the equation significantly. To answer your question also about how does this feel a little bit safer, it's just Pakistani intent has dropped. They're like, India's going to respond, and even the Pakistani generals don't actually want to get into a nuclear escalation ladder, right? So similarly with Israel, Ranveer, I think the only time at which Israel will use its nukes, or the only time Russia will use its nukes, so the only time I think any country is going to think about using its nukes, is when it believes that it's facing an existential threat, whether conventional or nuclear. So nuclear war is one of those unimaginable horrors, Ranveer, that we should all just be hoping and praying never occurs. I mean, if the history of this planet over the next 1,000 years, 10,000 years is written as these were weapons that were always in existence and never ended up being used, that's the single best outcome for everyone.
And it's unpredictable whether that'll be true or not.
Entirely unpredictable, right? And for a number of different reasons, right? So, for example, I give you the example of a collapse in the Pakistani state. Does that lead to a nuke ending up in the hands of a rogue actor? Totally unpredictable what that rogue actor then does. Or, during collapse, the Americans could fly in special forces and secure perfectly 100% of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal because the Pakistanis have collapsed. We don't know what's going to happen, which direction that goes in. Does Israel end up on the back foot of a massive conventional war over the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and end up in a situation where all these Arab countries are actually going to defend it? I don't think any war like this is going to happen, because the interesting thing about the geopolitical moment in the Middle East is that if you look at all of the Sunni Gulf Arab nations, they're all silent, leaning towards neutral to positive vis-a-vis Israel, because they hate and are afraid of Iran as much as anyone else in the region. So there's a Sunni Shia Israel triangle in the Middle East at the moment that seems to exist, where Iran is Shia, Hezbollah is Shia, Hamas is Sunni, but all the other Sunni countries like the UAE or Saudi Arabia or the other Gulf nations, they aren't really fighting Israel the way Iran is fighting Israel, right? So I don't think any war like that's going to happen, but if India and for whatever reason decides that it would like to invade and conquer Pakistan, at some point during that conquest, the Pakistani generals are going to be faced with a choice. Do we accept now becoming conquered by India? Or do we say, let's use our nuclear weapons? They understand if they use their nuclear weapons, India's response is also going to be nuclear and you're just destroying the country. But that's the choice that you get left with, right? So the nuclear weapon in many ways, Ranveer, is like, it's the equivalent of carrying a grenade around with you. So anything happens, no, I'll kill you, I'll kill myself, I'll kill everyone. You're kind of bringing the end of civilization that much closer if you choose to use a nuke. And the greatest risk for an escalation actually occurring is because countries have started to think about nukes as battlefield weapons rather than strategic weapons. So to say, hey, can I miniaturize a nuke so that instead of like it being a city killer, like the huge nukes say that the US has on ICBMs that can take out an entire city, one strike, can I use it just for a neighborhood, but a nuke? So it'll instantaneously wipe out one military unit. miniaturized nukes, battlefield nukes, thermonuclear warheads on the battlefield rather than like in reserve as an insurance policy, as a deterrent, as a as a platform in existence rather than to be used, that's extremely risky. The Pakistanis have developed them, the Americans have developed them, we don't. The Russians have developed them. It's a very, very risky idea to use nukes on the battlefield, but it is something that countries are thinking about. Where their threshold to say going nuclear is like some whole new game is being changed to saying, no, going nuclear is just one more instrument among other instruments that I'm going to use on the battlefield.
Hey, if you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out all the other clips we've uploaded on this channel. You'll find a clip related to almost every single topic as long as you're willing to search for it.